And now, a passage from The Earliest Relations Between the United States of America and Australia by Werner Levi. The United States of America initiated its Far Eastern trade in February 1784, when the Empress of China under Captain Green left New York for Canton. Many other ships soon followed in her wake. In 1789, 15 United States vessels were in Canton. They usually sailed by way of Cape Verde, Cape of Good Hope, and Strait of Sunda. Sailing conditions were such that this route could be used only during the spring. This was a serious handicap to extensive and regular trade and quite unsatisfactory to the owner of the Empress of China, Robert Morris. He decided to try another route. On June 20th, 1787, he dispatched his ship Alliance under Captain Reed from the Delaware River via the Cape of New Holland, as Australia was then called. It was a hazardous undertaking. No other ship had ever tried this passage before, and sailing conditions were unknown. Captain Reed was provided only with a map of the world, but the trip proved successful. Without throwing anchor en route, the Alliance arrived safely in Canton on December 22nd, 1787. The European captains there were amazed at this out-of-season arrival of the Americans. The event was so revolutionary that the British Admiralty became interested in it and made inquiries about the voyage. For the first time, an American ship had sailed the Tasman Sea. There was no colony then in Australia. It was not established until 1 month later, in January 1788. The significance of the trip lay in the discovery of a new trade route to China. In relation to Australia, it was clear that through the use of this route, commercial intercourse with American traders was bound to begin, once a settlement was established there. The plans of the British government for the colonization of New Holland were known to Americans and were eagerly watched. Even before the first settlers arrived at Botany Bay, Major Samuel Shaw, the first American consul in Canton, remarked that the colony may become an important settlement, especially when it is remembered that mighty Rome had a similar origin. His task was to discover trade possibilities and to stimulate interest in them. Neither he nor his friends and associates, the New England merchants, lost any opportunity for commerce in the Pacific. Hardly had the colony been founded in New South Wales when the first American ship arrived. In 1791, a Captain Thomas Patrickson, on a trip to China, had met in Cape Town Philip Gidley King, a member of Captain James Cook's crew and later governor of New South Wales. King told the captain about the new colony. He suggested to him that a mixed cargo might be sold profitably there. Little did King suspect what difficulties he was creating for himself with his advice. Patrickson, in the following March, sailed from Philadelphia as master of the Philadelphia and arrived in Port Jackson on November 1st, 1792, provided with a letter of recommendation to the governor, Philip, by the British minister to the United States, Phineas Bond. The ship had a cargo of assorted notions much needed in the settlement, and the speculative skipper sold the lot at a high figure, in addition to which he found employment for his ship between Sydney and Norfolk Island in the transport of stores. The assorted notions consisted of beef, pitch, tar, tobacco, gin, and rum. The high figure was 2,829 pounds for the beef, pitch, and tar, which were bought by the colonial administration. The more profitable remainder of the cargo was bought at an undisclosed figure by the army officers for resale to the population. Governor Philip bought the Philadelphia, and she never returned to America. Her captain Patrickson went to England and secured a contract from the British government for the shipping of convicts to Australia. Thus began a trade relation which proved beneficial to the American shipper but detrimental to New South Wales. For the cargo which American ships brought to Australia consisted to a very large extent of spirits. This was nothing novel to the New England exporter. When he traded in Newfoundland for fish, in Guinea for gold, in the southern colonies for ship stores, on the northwest coast for lumber, he had learned to appreciate his rum as an internationally welcome commodity. New South Wales did not disappoint him. Indeed, the clientele in the colony was most receptive. The colonists were not picked for their character. They were convicts sent to New South Wales from Great Britain as a punishment. A large contingent of their guardians from 1792 on were soldiers released from military prisons for the purpose of controlling the young colony. Governor Macquarie reported home in 1812 that the nature of the inhabitants is such that spirits must be had. The Americans, together with the British, provided them in abundance. The proportion of spirits to provisions in their cargoes grew larger and larger. One of the main reasons why the ships carried any other cargo at all was that foodstuffs and useful articles were convenient means to force the colonial administration to permit the landing of spirits too. For very often, the colony suffered from shortages of food and other necessary provisions, and the arrival of an American ship with the needed supplies was then most welcome. When the second American ship to Australia, the Hope, under Benjamin Page, arrived on December 24, 1792, Lieutenant Governor Gross examined the inventory of the commissary. He found it very small, and this fact, together with fear of a drought, determined him to buy the provisions. But I lamented on this occasion being obliged to purchase the spirits without which he would not agree to the disposal of the provisions, Gross wrote to London. A few years later, in 1802, the colony's reserves of salted meat were dwindling. The timely arrival of the American ship Arthur, with a quantity of meats, other supplies, and spirits, saved the situation. The provisions were landed with the spirits. Governor King had to purchase them, although he was loath to direct any purchase from strangers. Obviously, this kind of American trade was not favored with the governor's sympathy. It could hardly be otherwise. The importation of these large quantities of spirits contributed to a considerable extent to the deterioration of the colony's development in the early years of its existence. The effects could be noticed for many decades. Under the governorship of Gross, 1792 to 1794, the military succeeded in establishing a complete monopoly in New South Wales. Gross was not only unable to restrain the officers, but he was actually their tool. They controlled the political and economic life of the settlement and used this control to further their own personal welfare by every means. Spirits played an important role in their domination of the population. They bought them at reasonable prices from the Americans and sold them at figures often reaching 20 times the purchase price. It came to be a rule that provisions and other supplies of the American cargoes were bought by the commissary and that the spirits were bought by the army officers. In many cases, even the whole cargo was bought up by the officers. If the population ran out of cash with which to pay for the spirits, they paid for them with their labor or the products of their labor. In many instances, spirits replaced currency. It seems that the only thing of value to the population of the settlements at that time was spirits. The worst effect of the situation was that the governor was entirely in the hands of the officers. They obtained from him huge grants of land, which they worked with convict labor or free settlers who had gone into the officers' debt through the purchase of spirits. The whole structure of the New South Wales economy was thus changed. The plan, as originally conceived by the British government, to develop an economy of large public and small private farming was disregarded. Instead, a monopoly economy with the military clique as landowners arose. After Gross and his equally incapable successor Patterson had done nothing to improve the situation, Governor Hunter, who came to the colony in 1795, tried his best to stop the flood of spirits. He was not very successful. His successor, Governor King, was more determined to eradicate the evils of the spirit trade. He published a number of orders aiming at prohibiting the import of spirits in order to put an end to the unwarranted and scandalous monopolies that have existed in the colony, and which has not only been the cause of much distress and ruin to the settlers and other institutions, but also of great injury to the public interest and that of His Majesty's service. When the Follinsby, under her master James Perry of Newport, Rhode Island, arrived with some provisions and 13,000 gallons of spirits and 7,000 gallons of wine, and when at the same time, 1800, the Missouri, under her master William Vickery of Philadelphia, arrived with 7,000 gallons of spirits and 7,000 gallons of wine, Governor King created a precedent. He bought the provisions, but he prohibited the landing of the spirits and wine. Captain Perry protested. His plea was the assurance of those who had been here before that he could not fail of unheard of profit. Governor King remained unmoved. To spare his colleagues a similar disappointment, Perry then asked the governor to send a letter to the American consul in London, informing him that American ships were no longer allowed to land spirits in Australia. This King did. He pointed out to the American consul that the import of spirits was forbidden, and that the penalty for smuggling would be the confiscation of ship and cargo. He sent a similar letter to the British consul in America, telling him that no vessel would be allowed to land more than 300 gallons of spirits. It was the first diplomatic action concerning the relations between America and Australia. In spite of threats and warnings, American ships continued to bring and often succeeded in landing spirits. King promulgated additional laws and orders. He took advantage of the presence of another American ship loaded with liquors to increase the duty and incidental landing charges, and also to fix the sales price on these spirits brought for the purpose of impoverishing the inhabitants, destroying their health, and subverting the regularity necessary to be observed for the prosperity of the colony. But the perseverance of the American and also the British traders, the demand from the population for spirits, and the resistance of the profiteering officers proved too much for the governor. I believe all the nations of the earth agreed to inundate the colony with spirits, he complained. He became inconsistent in the application of his own orders. He failed to check the officers' monopoly and the traffic in spirits. Between September 1800 and October 1802, about 70,000 gallons of spirits and 33,000 gallons of wine, largely of American origin, were landed. The total population at that time was about 3,500. Although under King's orders, large quantities of spirits and wines were sent away, the total imports increased constantly. None of the following governors was able entirely to halt the influx of spirits. How prominently spirits still figured in the economy of the colony in 1810 is shown by the fact that the governor had a much-needed hospital built in exchange for a 3-year monopoly for the import of 45,000 gallons of spirits. The traffic did not cease until the outbreak of the War of 1812. Although the profits obtainable from the sale of spirits in New South Wales were certainly attractive to the American shipper, they were not his only motive. The risk of the dangerous reefs around the Australian coast, together with the discrimination by the colonial administration to which many American ships were subject, might have outweighed the attraction of possible profits. The shippers were interested in Australian trade mainly in connection with their China trade. Almost every vessel calling on Port Jackson proceeded to China. Usually it went there directly. Sometimes it went there after calling on the Fiji Islands or the northwest coast to take a cargo for China aboard. But finding a cargo for sale in China was no easy matter. Around 1800, China's foreign trade was a very one-sided affair. There were very few goods which Chinese desired to purchase from Westerners. Sealskins, furs, sandalwood, bêche de mer were about the only commodities acceptable. On the other hand, the Chinese had many goods which the Western traders wished to buy, so most of them had to be paid for in specie. When the Americans entered the China trade, they had to compete with the powerful and well-established East India Company. Even for this company, with all the resources of a powerful and well-developed England behind it, it was difficult to find cargoes acceptable to Chinese merchants. Consequently, the chance for the American trader to get a hold in the Chinese market was a slim one. If he wanted to break the firm grip of the East India Company, he had to offer the most attractive terms. He had to make a favorable impression with hard cash. But cash was a rare commodity in the America of 1800. And here, the New South Wales trade came in very usefully. Of course, the young colony was in a position similar to that of the United States. It, too, had little cash. It was not supposed to have any. The British government had hoped that New South Wales might quickly be self-supporting and would not need much specie. All payments were made either by barter or drafts on London. The only persons to have currency were the officers. Only after 1800 did some currency get into the hands of the inhabitants of the colony. The enormous purchase of American spirits quickly transferred what specie there was in the colony into the hands of the Americans. With the specie and drafts on London, the Americans went to China to trade with the Hong merchants and to destroy the monopoly of the East India Company. To judge by available statistics, their efforts were quite successful. The Chinese called a rich ship a ship freighted with dollars. The reason why the Chinese favor the American trade so much is on account of the great quantity of specie that is brought there, said a witness during the parliamentary investigation of the affairs of the East India Company in 1830, and another remarked, "If you pay in dollars, you can buy upon far better terms." They all agreed that the Americans had captured a considerable share of the profitable China trade. No wonder, then, that the American merchants did not like to miss the New South Wales business on their way to China. If, in addition, they could pick up a cargo of sealskins along the northwest coast or of sandalwood in the South Sea Islands, their happiness was complete. In choosing the route around New Holland, 2 motives influence us. Read the instructions to Captain Dexter of the John Jay in 1800. First, to avoid cruisers passing Straits of Sunda. Second, the advantage of trade at New Holland, getting money or exchange for the outward cargo. This aim of the American merchants was known to the colonial and home administrations. It was one more reason to discourage American trade with the colony. The government in London instructed the governor of New South Wales to exert his best efforts to prevent the current specie of the colony from being carried out of it. But the efflux of specie could not always be prevented. It was imperative to buy provisions from the Americans, and at times, even the liquor. A resident of the colony reported to the government in 1809, "So necessary indeed has it been found to admit the introduction of a certain quantity of spirits, that when the supply failed, spirits have been purchased from American traders touching at the colony at the serious sacrifice of every piece of coin it contained, money being the only payment which would be taken." In London, the Earl of Liverpool was quite aware that English ships reached New South Wales only very irregularly. He was also aware of the practice of the Americans, as he expressed it, of taking away dollars from the colony for the Chinese market. He hoped, though, that the more regular arrival of supplies from England would do away with the necessity of making purchases of any American goods, and that the trade of New South Wales will henceforth be retained in its natural and proper channel. The hopes of the Earl did not materialize before the Anglo-American War put an end to American-Australian trade. Arrivals of English ships remained irregular and were comparatively rare altogether. The reason for this was the East India Company Charter, and for the same reason, the quite unexpected result of American-Australian contacts was the capture of a large part of Australia's foreign trade by the Americans. According to the Charter of the East India Company, no ships were permitted to trade in that part of the globe in which Australia is situated without special permission of the company. This order could naturally be applied to British subjects only. It was a sufficient protection for the company's monopoly as long as trade on the seven seas was mainly a British affair. But when the Americans turned up and proved to be keen competitors in the Pacific trade, the effect of the charter was no longer the same. The East India Company was not itself interested in the comparatively small New South Wales trade. At the same time, it insisted on its rights vis-a-vis potential British competitors, who were thus barred from commercial intercourse with the colony. Consequently, very few British merchants were able to send their ships to Port Jackson. They had to watch the Americans establishing a regular trade and making sizable profits. About 42 trading ships from America called during the period 1792 to 1812. In addition, from about 1800 on, an ever-increasing number of whalers dropped anchor in Australian waters. Their trade was negligible and quite out of proportion to the enormous trouble they were causing the colonial administration. This situation suited neither the British merchants nor the free inhabitants of New South Wales and their governor. They wanted freedom of trade. The London firm of Enderby and Company protested to the government in 1800. The Americans, hearing that New South Wales is considered within the chartered seas of the East India Company and that no British merchants can send goods to that colony without the risk of seizure, have at times sent small vessels there with investments of goods in their way to India or the northwest coast of America, and have benefited themselves so much thereby that there is no doubt, if the restrictions are still continued against British merchants sending goods there, that they will monopolize all the advantages of the trade to New South Wales, and this country will have the expense of supporting it. A long petition signed by 1,000 citizens of the colony asked the government to do away with the restrictions imposed by the Charter of the East India Company. None of these protests produced any action on the part of the government. As a result, a large share of New South Wales trade was forced into illegal channels, or at least devious methods were used so as to be in nominal accord with the law. It began with British merchantmen hoisting American flags and trying to circumvent restrictions in this way. When this was prohibited or lost its effectiveness, British as well as Australian merchants formed partnerships with American citizens. In this case, the British and Australian merchants could justify the use of the American flag. The Americans, whose trade was not very well regarded by the British government and was often discriminated against, could point to their British associations and trade more freely. Through this cooperation, an entirely new trade was developed. Up to then, the East India Company had shipped Chinese goods destined for Australia either to Bengal or even London for transshipment. Since the American merchants were not interested in trading between China and New South Wales, no trade was flowing in that direction. The partnership of Australians with Americans made it possible to organize direct shipments from China to New South Wales. The costs of transshipping were eliminated, and the competition with the East India Company was increased. London was opposed to the infraction of the East India Company's interests and informed the governor of the colony accordingly. He tried to prevent the partnerships by prohibiting or making it difficult for settlers and Americans to get together. One of his orders in 1804 prohibited Australians either from being hired by Americans or from going aboard their ships. Another order forbade American ships to sail in Australian waters or to establish trading centers in New South Wales. But it was easy to get around such orders. Something more drastic had to be done. The governor asked for instructions from London. Before an answer reached him, another application was made by 2 Australian inhabitants to establish a partnership with Americans. Their plan was to ship sandalwood and biche de mer from the South Sea Islands to China and to bring back Chinese goods for the New South Wales market. This was legitimate trade and could only have been of benefit to the colony, but being bound by instructions from London, Governor King had to refuse his permission for the partnership, although he himself would have liked to promote the commerce of the colony. When he wrote to his government about the application for the partnership, he stated, "As I conceive it, that measure would lead to opening an intercourse with this colony and the company's possessions. I have resisted the importunate solicitations on that behalf, as it militates so much against His Majesty's instructions thereon, but in continuing those restrictions I have assured the adventuring inhabitants, being His Majesty's subjects, of my earnest wish and exertions to promote their endeavors. I cannot close the subject without humbly suggesting the necessity of instructions being sent prescribing the intercourse and connection that may be allowed between inhabitants and Americans. The result of London's policy was that the two inhabitants did illegally what they were not permitted to do legally. The procedure was characteristic of the methods used to overcome legal restrictions. They left on an English boat, ostensibly for London. When they had sailed for 4 days, they met the American ship at an appointed place and transferred to it. They then proceeded according to their original plan. When they returned from China aboard the American ship, the Criterion, under Captain Peter Chase, they attempted to land their cargo of tea, silks, and nankins. They did not succeed. Thereupon, they sailed to Hobart Town and renewed their attempt, again without success. The officials there had the same instructions as those in Port Jackson and were determined to stop all commerce which ran counter to the interests of the East India Company. Eventually, the cargo was smuggled into the country. This clandestine commerce continued in spite of the vigilance of the authorities until the charter of the East India Company was revised in 1839 and some of the restrictions upon Australian trade eliminated. This brief survey shows that the earliest relations between America and Australia were purely commercial. Their moral basis was not very commendable. For this, the British government's policy must largely be blamed. The attempt to prevent the Americans from trading with the new colony was anachronistic. At the same time, it indicated that the British government misjudged the spirit of the Yankee trader. It should have known that decrees, orders, or proclamations could not restrain the Boston and Philadelphia merchants' quest for profits. The natural result of the government's oppressive action was to drive the relations between New South Wales and the United States into undesirable and illegitimate channels. A more progressive policy would no doubt have been more beneficial to all concerned. As it was, the advantage of trading was on the side of the Americans alone. They profited by the commerce with New South Wales, and perhaps more important, this commerce helped them to break the monopoly of the East India Company in the Far East.